Yes, thank you very much. That's the official start, and now we know we're underway. Thank you, Torrin. Okay, well, I'm going to read today from John's Gospel, chapter 9. John's Gospel, chapter 9. And this is a little passage that has a lot to say to us. This is John chapter 9 and verse 1. It says, "And as Jesus passed by, he saw a man which was blind from his birth. And his disciples asked him, saying, Master, who did sin, this man or his parents, that he was born blind? Jesus answered, Neither hath this man sinned, nor his parents, but that the works of God should be made manifest in him." Verse 4 says, "I must work the works of him that sent me, while it is day. The night cometh when no man can work. As long as I'm in the world, I am the light of the world." And when he had thus spoken, he spat on the ground and made clay of the spittle, and he anointed the eyes of the blind man with the clay, and he said to him, "Go, wash in the pool of Siloam," which is by interpretation sent. And he went his way, therefore, and washed and came seeing. Now, in this story, backing up a little bit, there's at least three really important points. So, the disciples are walking along with Jesus, and they come upon this man, and the text tells us that he was blind from birth. And so the disciples are putting on their religious thinking caps, and they're trying to understand this according to the theology that was in their minds, and according to their understanding of how the relationship between God and man works. And so they made an assumption, and they assumed because the man was born blind, somebody must have done something wrong. Someone must have sinned, because that, in verse 3, Torrin, if you can put that on the screen again. No, verse 2, I'm sorry. The disciples asked, "Master, who did sin, this man or his parents, that he was born blind?" So they assumed that either it's because of the man's wrongdoing, which is kind of hard to understand since he was born blind. Kind of hard to figure that out. Obviously, they just said it without really giving it much thought. Or was it his parents? In other words, somebody must have sinned for this tragedy or this misfortune to have happened. But Jesus' answer is enlightening, and it shows that their assumption was wrong. And their assumption is not much different than the way people think, even to this very day. That's what people think. That's what we tend to think sometimes. It's a natural human response. When something bad happens, somebody must have done something wrong to have caused it. But Jesus said in verse 3, "Neither hath this man sinned, nor his parents." Now that doesn't mean that the man and his parents were, along with Jesus, the only sinless individuals ever born. He didn't mean that they'd never done anything wrong. What he means when he says, "Neither hath this man sinned nor his parents," is it has nothing to do with it. In other words, there's no causal relationship. In other words, the assumption of the disciples was wrong. Or to say, yes, another way, sin's got nothing to do with it. It's no relationship. The mistakes and the failures of the parents or the man himself, completely unrelated. There's no connection. In other words, it's not their fault. Nobody's to blame. And then he says, "But that the works of God should be made manifest in him." And the King James translation has a period there. Now, this might seem like a really picky kind of point to make, but I've got to make this point. And I challenge you to sometime do what I did this morning. I got out my phone and I used the internet search, and you can see pictures, you can see photographs of the manuscripts from which the New Testament was translated, the early manuscripts, Greek manuscripts of the New Testament. And what you'll notice if you look at those Greek manuscripts of the New Testament is a bunch of Greek letters on papyrus, but it's just a string of letters like that. There's no punctuation, There's no difference between capitals and small letters. It's just a string of Greek letters, all the same size. And so the translator's got a challenge. Not only does he have to figure out what the words are, but he's got to come up with, to put it into English, let's say, some punctuation. Because listen, there's no punctuation in the original manuscripts. And so I'm going to suggest to you that the punctuation that the King James translators put here was a mistake. And you have to understand, it's okay to say the text of the New Testament is divinely inspired, but it's not okay to say the King James translators were divinely inspired. There are people who think that. There are people who, they call that King James only. But that's not true. They were just ordinary people. There were other translations into English before the King James translators from which they borrowed. Tyndale, for one. They borrowed much of Tyndale's language. And there were translators after him. And there were translators in other languages too. And they all did their best. I'm not finding fault with anybody. But I'm going to suggest to you that let's try a different kind of punctuation here. Let's say in verse 3, when they said, "Who sinned, this man or his parents, causing him to be born blind?" Let's try this. Jesus answered and said, "Neither hath this man sinned nor his parents," period. Let's try that. Now we have a brand new thought. See, first he answered their question. They want to know, why did this happen? So he said, "You're wrong. Neither hath this man sinned nor his parents." In other words, the sin of the parents and the sin of this man is irrelevant. And now let's start a new thought, a new sentence. "But that the works of God should be made manifest in him, comma, I must work the works of him that sent me," period. How about that? That gives us a complete thought. So he first of all sets aside their question about who's to blame. And then the next thing he says then is, "But that the works of God should be made manifest in him, I must work the works of him that sent me." Now to me that makes much more sense, because he proceeds then to work the works of God, and he heals the man. Right? So the works of God were not his blindness, because Jesus, if it were, Jesus just got through undoing it. The works of God were what Jesus was sent to do. So he doesn't address the question of why he was born blind. He sets that aside. It's as though he's saying, you know, disciples, it's not about this man's mistakes or his parents. We've got something more important to look at. That's got nothing to do with it. Here's what we should be thinking about. In other words, God sent me so that this man in this condition, however he got here, can move on out of this condition. God sent me to work the works of him that sent me, is what he said. And then talks about being the light of the world. Then he takes the clay and puts it in his eyes. And we'll talk about that in a second. But before we go on, I'd like to just show you that I'm not the only one that thinks or had this thought that this has occurred to, that the punctuation is wrong, or the idea that's suggested by the punctuation is incorrect. The Message translation, Torrin, if you go back to verse 1, is really good, and it brings out exactly the point I just got through making. And probably I should have read that first, because it's much more artfully said. Walking down the street, Jesus saw a man blind from birth. Okay? His disciples asked, "Rabbi, who sinned, this man or his parents, causing him to be born blind?" So far, just exactly like what we read before. Next verse. Jesus said, "You're asking the wrong question. You're looking for someone to blame. There's no such cause and effect here. Look instead for what God can do." Isn't that a good thought? See, I think that gets right to the heart of what the problem is. It's a human problem. We tend to, when confronted with a bad situation, or a tragedy, or a misfortune, or something that's a painful situation, what we tend to think first is, who's to blame? Often we blame ourselves. I don't know if you've ever had this problem, but I think a lot of people do. Sometimes we look at our lives and, well, I wish I'd made this decision. I wish I'd made that decision. I wish I'd gone here and not gone there. I wish I'd done this and not done that. We're kind of bad about that, to tell you the truth. But what Jesus is saying here is you're asking the wrong question. If you're looking for someone to blame, and even if the blame is yourself, you're looking at it all wrong. So that's the wrong thing to be thinking. That's the wrong way to look at it. Let me read that again. You're asking the wrong question. You're looking for someone to blame. I think anytime you find yourself blaming yourself or looking for someone else to blame, I think anytime you get into that mode of thinking, what Jesus said here is you're asking the wrong question. So here's the point. Jesus didn't just, see, here's this man born blind, and so the disciples bring up this theological question. Who sinned to cause him to be born blind? And now Jesus, I think we've made the point here that he says that's the wrong question. You're looking for someone to blame. Look instead for what God can do. And so far they're just having a little theological discussion at the expense of this poor man who's sitting there in the dirt, you know. But see, Jesus was not content to leave it that way. He didn't just leave it using this man as a case study or an example to talk about theology. Here's the bigger point of this whole story. This is the first point is sin's got nothing to do with it. And that's a point you should ponder sometimes. You know, in the church world, you hear all kinds of things. There's lots of hurtful, damaging things that pass for, I don't even want to call it theology, church talk. We have a lot of church talk that we take to be true. And sometimes when something bad happens, you find people very spiritually thinking, well, you must have left a door open, as though there are some doors, you know, that you can open or shut. As though if you had just prayed more, or prayed the right way, or prayed longer, or prayed more intensely, you can ward off anything negative from happening. That's just a bunch of nonsense. That's just like what Jesus was saying here about you're looking for someone to blame. This leaving doors open and shutting doors, that's not true. That's not real. That's just spiritual babble. Here's the point. It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter how it came to this point. Here's what matters. How do we move on? And see, here's the bigger picture here that you need to get. Could you give me the King James again? And let's start with verse 6. Verse 6 says, when he had thus spoken. So see, now they've had their discussion. Now he's ready to act. When he had thus spoken, he spat on the ground and made clay of the spittle and anointed the eyes of the blind man with the clay. And by the way, this is probably not the best practice if you're going to pray for someone. Spit on the ground. And though Jesus did it, and so we have to ask ourselves, what did he do that for? Now get this picture. I mean, you know, when you read it in King James, it all sounds very polite. He spit on the ground and then stirred it up with his finger, and then the poor man didn't know what was coming because he's blind. So Jesus then sticks his finger in the guy's eye with mud all over it. So, you know, the man could have said, it's bad enough I'm sitting here a beggar and blind. Now you stick your finger and I put this mud in my eye. But Jesus did it for a reason. In verse 7 says, he said to him, go. Now up until this time, he's just been sitting there. But Jesus has got something in mind. Move on. In other words, you can't just sit here in this condition pondering who failed, who made a mistake, who sinned. You're just spinning your wheels, you're stalled in that condition. Jesus said, let's get moving, let's move on from this point. In one sense, it doesn't matter how we got here. I'm not a golfer, you know, I don't know much about any sports, but I know, I've seen enough on TV to know that sometimes when they hit the golf ball, it doesn't go where they mean for it to go and it flies off in the bushes or, you know, over in the water or somewhere like that. And what they always say is, for your next shot, you gotta play it where it is. In other words, you gotta, even if they made a mistake and shot it off in the wrong direction, well, you know, at that point it doesn't really matter. how it got there. You got to go to where the ball is and hit it from there. And so Jesus is saying with this blind man, it doesn't matter how we got here, but here we are. So here's what we're going to do, blind man. Now you got mud in your eyes, go and wash. He did that so he could send him and make him get moving and get up from where he was and move forward. And not only that, he said, there's a special place I want you to go. He could have just said, go to the faucet over there. Well, they didn't have a faucet. He said, no, there's a pool called Siloam, and John tells us here in the text in verse 7, he says, which is by interpretation sent. Sent means you're at one place and you go in another place. I think the whole point of this with the mud in his eye is so that he could start moving. And in a spiritual sense, it means he's moving on. He's not just going to sit there. And probably the man himself was thinking the same thing the disciples were thinking. What did I do wrong to cause this to happen? Well, maybe nothing, But at this point, here we are, so it doesn't matter. So Jesus' idea was, let's see what God can do. Let's move forward. No matter where we are, no matter where we find ourselves, no matter how we got here, in a sense, it doesn't matter. The only thing that matters is, what can God do right now? Well, He can do a lot of things right now, but we just have to start moving. He's here to help. That's the point. I think you could also draw the conclusion that God's not in the business of causing things to happen, of bad things to happen, but He is in the business of helping when there are bad things that happen. And helping. What made me start thinking about this in my off time, in my farm work. See, I'm here today, but Monday through Saturday I'm doing farm work for our family farming operation, and so we have wheat land, and we don't have the equipment or the know-how to get it cut ourselves. We have to hire these custom cutters, they call it, and they drive down from Ellis, Kansas. And so when the guys came to cut the wheat, they did it, and they're very efficient at it. Expensive too, but hope they're not watching this, but I'm not complaining, but they do a good job. But anyway, we have to settle up after it's all done and write them a check and pay them for it. So while we're sitting there talking to them, they said, oh, well, we had something happen over the last year. I don't know if you remember this, but some wildfires came through Kansas and burned along I-70. And I kind of vaguely remember that happening, but didn't pay much attention to it. But they did, and here's what happened. The wildfire came through there and burned their house to the ground. And it was a real tragedy, of course, But they said, here's the thing. The fire started about 1:30 in the morning, and 30 minutes later the house was just ashes. That's how fast and how hot it was. If we had been asleep in the house where the fire came from the south, that's right where our bedroom was. We would have had no time to wake up and get out of there. He said, but as it happened, they had been in another town. This was around the end of the year, around the holiday season, and they had gone to Kansas City, actually, to participate in a church where they were taking donations and buying things for poor families. And they had traveled out of town to this church service. And even though it was a terrible tragedy, I said, but look, if you hadn't been out of town, you would have died, you would have been gone. And I said, yeah, I think that was, we didn't know. We didn't know how can you plan for something like that? But God was there to help, you see. And I think here's something interesting, and maybe you've never considered this way, but Paul actually makes this precise point in Romans chapter 8, and I'm going to look at that next. This is actually a familiar verse, and I'm not going to change the punctuation of this one, but I am going to suggest that people take it to mean something it doesn't mean. It's in Romans chapter 8 and verse 28. And let me show you what the King James and don't get the wrong idea. I like the King James translation, but I seem like I'm kind of picking on them here. They did the best they could, but it's okay for us to think about it and think differently. Romans 8, verse 28, this is a verse that lots of people hold on to, but I think many people think it means something that it doesn't really say. Because if you see, here's how you can tell. If you read it in the context of the surrounding verses, that gives you much more insight into what it's actually, what the author is conveying to us. Here's what verse 28 says in isolation, all by itself. Paul says, "And we know that all things work together for good to them that love God, to them whom he hath called according to his purpose." To him who are called according to his purpose. Now, at first glance, if you're a casual reader and don't really give it much thought or read the surrounding verses, you might get the impression that God is like some kind of a puppet master, and everything that's happening, God's in mysterious ways causing everything to happen. Now, if you think that way, you are left in a situation of saying, like the man we just read about, that God caused that to happen. I'm going to suggest to you that that's not really what Paul is saying. Paul is not here saying that God causes everything to happen the way it happens. Let me suggest to you another way of reading this. Now, King James translation was made in 1611. That's when they translated it into English. But the famous reformer, Martin Luther, he lived about a century earlier in the 1500s, in the early part of the 1500s. And Martin Luther spoke German. He didn't speak English, and so he knew nothing about the King James translation. And 100 years before the King James translators put this text down on paper, Martin Luther said to himself, and I don't want to get into the whole story about why he was, but he was in confinement for his own protection because the church was out to get him. And it's an exciting story. It's really a thrilling story. This prince who was protecting him staged a fake kidnapping and had these armed men ride up and throw a bag over his head and drag him off to a castle. That was so he could escape from certain death at the hands of the Roman Catholic Church. They had demanded that he renounce and recant his writings, and he said, "How can I recant my writings? My conscience, I'm captive to my conscience." So they got mad about that, and they were going to kill him, and they would have, except this prince intervened and snatched him away and took him to a castle. So while he's in this castle, he's got nothing to do. He's got to stay out of circulation until like in a movie, till the heat is off. And so he's got nothing to do, so he said, "I know what I'll do. I'll translate the Bible into German, which is the language of the ordinary people." So I said all that to say to you, Luther didn't have the benefit or the problem of knowing what the King James translators were going to do. He had the Greek text. And let me tell you something else about the Greek language. And you can tell this by looking at these Bibles called interlinear Greek New Testaments, where they have the exact wording of the Greek, and if you were to take the exact wording in English, and here's why I tell you that, the sentence structure is not the same. The verbs and the subjects are not in the same order, so you really have to think creatively to make it make sense. Now here's how Luther translated this verse. See if you can tell what the difference is. We know that in all things God works with us for good. We know that in all things God works together with us for good. Now, do you see what the difference is? The King James translation said, "We know that all things work together for good." Luther said it this way, "We know that in all things God works with us together for good." Now, it's saying two completely different things. In the King James translation, it seems to imply that God makes things work, and there's some mysterious purpose. That's where people get this idea that God works in mysterious ways. And I don't know why I had that car wreck and lost use of my arm, but God has some plan. Well, you know what? That's like blaming God for everything bad that happens. But here's what Luther says. In all things, in other words, things happen in life. Who knows why they happen? A man's born blind. Tragedies happen. Misfortunes happen. But Luther says, in all things, in all these things that happen, God is there. And He's working with us for good. Now, I think you could see that in that story we read about the man born blind. Jesus set aside why it happened. But He said, here I am to do the works of God. God is with us to work for good. Now, I'll tell you why I think this is the more correct translation. In all things, God works together with us for good. If you read the previous two verses, which we're going to do, you'll see that he's explicitly saying that. Turn back up to verse 26, if you don't mind. It says, I'm just going to read here, then I'm going to comment. Likewise, the Spirit helpeth. The Spirit helpeth. He means the Holy Spirit, God's Spirit. Likewise, the Spirit helpeth our infirmities. Infirmity means weakness or inability. He says, for we know not what we should pray for as we ought. He says, we don't even know enough to pray correctly. But the Spirit itself maketh intercession for us with groanings which cannot be uttered. He says, now when he says, likewise the Spirit helpeth, you know, I'll call to your remembrance, I'm not going to turn and read it. Jesus, before he departed from the disciples in the 14th, 15th, and 16th chapter of John's Gospel, we could turn and read that, but I'm just going to tell it to you right now. Jesus said, after he told them he was going back to the Father, he said, but I will send you another comforter, is what the King James says. The word for comforter, when he was talking about the Holy Spirit, was a Greek word parakletos, which means one called alongside to help. You know, we use that prefix para in our everyday talk when the ambulance comes. It's paramedics. They come alongside to help. April, what was it they call the helpers in the school now? Para. They have these, yeah, and they just call them paras for short, right? The helpers, in other words. That's what they are, right? The helpers. Jesus said, I will send you a para. That's what the Holy Spirit is, the para. He comes alongside to help. That's what he is. And so Paul is here saying the same thing. The Spirit helpeth. Now, in the King James translation, the word help, we understand that. Like if I saw you out there struggling with your yard and I just happened to drive by and said, here, let me help you with that. You know, maybe I'll bring my lawnmower and we'll get it done twice as fast. Maybe I'm stronger than you. Maybe I can push it harder. Maybe not, but I'm just using that as an example. A helper, you see. Jesus said the Holy Spirit is a para. He comes alongside to help. And Paul here says, we've got weaknesses. We've got, inabilities. For one thing is we can't see very far. He says we don't even know how to pray as we ought. You know what? If we had so much knowledge that we knew there was going to be a car around a stop sign, if we knew that, we'd slow down, right? We'd avoid it. Paul's here saying we don't even have, it's our weakness, it's our infirmity. But guess what? We've got somebody who's strong. He's a para. He comes alongside to help. Now, this helpeth. See, if you just read the King James translation in English, you think help. Okay, I know what help means. But let me tell you what the Greek word is. This little word help, this little 4-letter word help, is a 3-syllable, big, long word in the Greek language. Now let me read it to you, and then you'll see what it means. First, I'm going to tell you what it says, and then I'm going to break it apart, because you need to get this. What's translated helpeth is, it's a 3-part, 3-syllable word, sun anti lambano. It's got 3 parts to it. Lambano means take hold, like if you take hold with somebody. Like if you see somebody's carrying a weight, you take hold with them. Anti, we know what that means. We use that in English. Anti means against, right? Is that right? Anti means against. And then sun means together with. So what if you put it all together? Sun means together with, anti means against, lambano means something you take hold of. It means the Holy Spirit comes and takes hold with us against whatever it might be, whatever this situation is. Paul says we don't know how to pray as we ought, but the Holy Spirit does, and it says He makes intercession for us with groanings which cannot be uttered. In other words, in our heart, we don't even know how to put it into words, but the Holy Spirit understands our heart, and you might say the groanings and the inarticulate things that we don't even know how to formulate into words. He knows how it goes, and it says He intercedes for it. He comes alongside and takes hold with us. The next verse says, and He that searcheth the hearts knoweth what is the mind of the Spirit, because He makes intercession for the saints according to the will of God. In other words, He knows what we're struggling with. He knows what's going on in our lives. He knows what we're dealing with. He even knows what we're going to deal with. And He comes along and takes hold together with us against those things. And then we get this next verse in verse 28. And I'm going to read you Luther's version. And we know that in all things God works together with us for good. What he's saying is, he's not even dealing with why the things. He's saying whatever the things, God's by His Holy Spirit. And let me tell you something. It's my example about mowing the yard, and I might come along and say, let me help, maybe I'm stronger than you. Well, you know what? I may not be, but I'll tell you who is stronger than you in dealing with all the things we have to deal with. That's God by His Holy Spirit. And Paul's here saying, no matter what the things are, like in the golf game where if you hit the ball into the bad ground and you're in the rough ground and there's weeds all around, doesn't matter. He knows how to, He's got more strength than you do. He's got more sight than you do. He's got more ability. And He comes along with you to take hold with you against all of those things. Now, I don't know about you, but I think that's a very positive thing. That's a very encouraging idea. And I think it's no accident that having laid this groundwork, you see, when I read the writings of the Apostle Paul, I get this impression that here's a man who has seen things that are so big and so powerful and so strong that he struggles to get them across to us. He struggles to put them into words where we can comprehend the bigness of God's care and His love and concern for us. And it's no accident that just a few verses later, I'm just going to skip us a bit, that he says this in verse 31. Trying to sum all this up. It's like he's thinking, I don't know how to say all this, but verse 31 says, what shall we say to these things? What things? Those things I've just been talking about. If God be for us, who can be against us? In other words, we come up against things that are bad or that are hard or that are difficult that we would, not want to deal with. But he says, hey, you know what? What can we say about this? We've got God who by His Holy Spirit comes alongside to take hold with us against these things. And He takes the things that are in our heart that we don't even know how to put them into a formal prayer, and He intercedes for us with things we can't even put into speech. What can we say about this? He says, if God is for us, who can be against us? I read another translation once that said, if God is for us, what can ever be successful against us? So I think the point of all this is, just like Jesus came to that man who was born blind, and the disciples were just wanting to discuss who was to blame and who was at fault, Jesus said, that's not the issue. The issue is let's get up and move forward. Let's go from here. How we got here doesn't matter. Really, that's true. You need to see that. How we got here is basically irrelevant. But here's what's relevant. How do we move forward from this point where we are? Because we've got God who comes alongside us, takes hold with us against the things that confront us. And whatever those things might be, He's there to help. Okay, I think that's all we got today. Let's all stand up.